So to make the little Yagi antenna then, what you're going to need is some aluminium box tubing. This is 12mm by 12mm square, and it's 250mm long. Now for the reflectors, you're going to need some tubing. This is 5mm in diameter, and this is 300mm long, but we're not going to use all this. You've probably got enough here to make 2 Yagi antennas. And next I've got some aluminium tubing that is 3mm in diameter, and we're going to use this for the parasitic elements. It's 300mm long, and we're going to need about 1.5 lengths of this. Now I've made a template that you can download. There'll be a link in the description, and this template is to help you to drill your holes in the boom of the little Yagi in the box tubing here. So what you want to do is carefully cut out the lengths of this template using a sharp craft knife and a ruler, because what we're going to do is stick it directly to the boom itself, and then we know exactly where we need to drill our holes. So I've got the template stuck down to the 2 sides there on this box tubing, but if you don't have a drill press, the best way to do this is to stick the template down on all 4 sides of the box tubing and drill each hole individually. Don't try to drill all the way through at once if you don't have a drill press, because you will not get it straight. But you can still do a good job if you haven't got a drill press, just by taking your time and drilling each individual hole. Now I've started to punch a small hole in the center of the template here, where I'm going to drill the holes for the elements. Now you may also notice on this template I've put a small black mark directly in the middle of each circle here, and what I'm doing is I'm just punching a hole on that mark there, just so we get it drilled out as accurately as possible. So I'm ready to drill the holes now. I've got a 3mm drill bit and a 5mm drill bit, and you want to make sure that your drill bits are really sharp. Make sure they're quite new, because if you don't, this aluminium is really soft and it'll heat up and it will slightly bend out of shape as well. You won't get such a clean hole going all the way through the Yagi, so your finished Yagi won't look as polished as it could be if you just use some sharp drill bits. So that's all the holes drilled in there. So what I'm going to do now is soak it in some water to remove this template off here, and then I'm going to give it a good rub down with some wire wool just to get rid of any of the burring on here, and then just clean it up a little bit as well. It's much easier to clean it up now than try and get in there with some wire wool when you've got all the elements in place. So now that we've prepared and cleaned up the boom, we want to start making the parasitic elements. Now these are the elements that go forward of the main driven element that will be going here. These larger ones are the reflective elements, but we're going to be making those last. So we're making these parasitic elements now. So you want to get your 3mm diameter tubing, and you want to cut off 4 sections at 54mm long, because we need to take into account the fact that the boom is 12mm in length, so we want the driven element to protrude out of the sides at 21mm. So I'm just going to use a vise and a hacksaw blade to cut off the parasitic elements then. So I've got a length in the vise here, so I've got my ruler, and I'll just butt my ruler up against it, and starting from this end, measure in 54mm and just put a little black mark just there. And then what I'm going to do is move this black mark closer to the vise, because I can use this vise to keep my saw blade quite straight using the side of the vise here. And I'm not going to cut directly on that black mark. I'm going to cut just to the side of it, because the hacksaw blade adds a couple of millimeters to the cutting, so I'll end up cutting it a little bit short. And I want to cut it on the opposite side of the line as well, because what I can do is come in with a file and file it down just to get it really spot on at that 54mm, and then I can file down the rest of the tubing, and again measure from a flat surface here, measure down and do exactly the same, and then that's the most accurate way I can come up with to make these parasitic elements. And then, as I said, I can just use this flat file to just take it down, clean up the edges. It's really quite soft stuff, this aluminium, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to use a file on it at all. So now that we've got our 4 parasitic elements cut, we're going to start attaching them to the boom. Now this is the method that I've come up with to do this, and it's the best one that I can come up with so far, and the cleanest one as well. So we're going to use super glue, and I've also got this little jig measuring tool here that's a plastic tube, and it's cut off at 21 millimeters, and that's the length of parasitic element that we want protruding out from the side of the boom. So what I can do is put this on one side, and then I can line up the parasitic element like so, and then I know this side is exactly 21 millimeters, and when it's all dry I can use the same tool again just to check this side, and if it's a little bit long I can come in with the file and just file it down a little bit. So I'm not going to try and glue this all in one go. What I'm going to do is tack all the parasitic elements in first, and how I do that is at the moment it's directly centered on the boom, roughly in the position where we want it, and I'm going to put the super glue in through this top hole here. I did originally try to glue the outside and you know, get some capillary action going on by letting it flow down in between the small gap in the hole and the parasitic element, but it was very messy and difficult to clean up. So what I'm going to do is pull it this way a little bit, and I'm going to try and get a couple of drops of super glue to land directly on the parasitic element through that hole there, and then what I'm going to do is pull it backwards again and also give it a little turn, and then get my measuring tool and use that to position it. And then what we can do is just let the super glue work, let it dry, and it'll hold it in place, so we can do the other 4, and then we can add some more super glue at the end just to make sure it's really strong. So now that we've got the 4 parasitic elements tacked in place, we can now go ahead and add a little bit more super glue just to permanently attach those in place, so they're not going to move anytime soon. Now the super glue that I'm using is some really cheap stuff. It's from the pound shop, and I can tell you that as far as comparing this to some of the brand names, it's not as super as some of those are, but this works out perfectly for this application, because it does mean we've got a few seconds where we can manipulate this before this stuff sets and become permanent. And some of the branded names as well, they're now kind of shipping in a gel-like state just to try and cut down on accidents, and you won't be able to do this with the gel type because you do want the super glue to flow. So now what I'm going to do then is just hold the boom at a slight angle like this, and I'm going to inject a little bit more super glue through this hole, and what I want it to do is flow down the inside of the boom and accumulate around the parasitic element at the bottom here. And I'm going to do that to all 4, and then hold on to it for a few minutes just to make sure it's penetrated and it dries off. Then I'm going to turn it around and do the exact same thing on the other side. So we've got both ends of the parasitic element on the inside really super glued down onto this boom. So it's just a matter of injecting a little bit of super glue in there, and you kind of get a feel for how much super glue comes out of this, so you can squeeze it quite lightly. Although the end one you can come in from the end anyway just to make sure, but that just let that settle down now, let it do its thing, and then we'll turn it around and do the opposite side. So I'm just giving it a little bit of a shake as well, just to help you know, it run down the inside of that boom there. And also, if you do get a bit carried away and add too much super glue, it will run down out of the ends of the boom as well, all onto your workbench and possibly on your hand as well. So just be aware of that. Either use some gloves or keep some isopropanol alcohol to hand, just in case there are any little accidents. But you kind of get a feel for how much super glue you're putting in there. You know, just a few drops, you don't need a great deal at all. And now we can turn it over and do the opposite side. So now that we've got the first set of parasitic elements in place, we're going to start making the rest of them, which form the X on this X Wing Yagi here. So I've got a length of the 3mm tubing here, and what you want to do is just press that into the top there. Now you can either use your ruler to measure off at 21mm, or if you've made a little plastic tube like I have, put that over the top. Then you can just make a little black mark there where you're going to cut it off with the hacksaw blade. And because this is sitting on top of the element that runs through the boom here, we measured it off, and this one is now measured precisely for this one. So I do each one in turn. What I'm going to do is cut this one off to the exact size, and then super glue this one in, and then I'm going to do the same with the second one, same with the third, and finally the fourth one. Turn it upside down and do the rest of the parasitic elements that way. And that way it's the best way to get it nice and accurate with all your parasitic elements the exact same length. So little black mark there. So again, same method. I'm using the vise and hacksaw to cut this, and I've got it lined up with the little black mark, so I'm cutting on the opposite side of the black mark. And if I cut it a little bit long, it's as I say, same as the other ones, really easy to get in with a flat file and just take off any excess. Now to attach these ones in place, what I'm going to do is apply the super glue just around the hole like so, and then apply a little bit on the tube itself, only a really small amount. You don't want a lot because you'll end up getting it all over your work and everywhere else. And then push it down through the hole, try and give it a little turn just to manipulate that super glue around, and then you want to make sure that it's nice and straight, and just bend it so it's straight before the super glue sets. So now that super glue has dried, it's made a really clean job of it. There's no excess glue spilling out onto the boom at all that we need to clean up later, and that's why I came up with this method, because trying to get in there with some wire wool, it's really quite difficult to clean it up afterwards. And you can use some isopropanol or something similar, but then the isopropanol gets down in between there and loosens the glue off that you don't want to loosen off, that holds the element in place. So if you just do it in use this method, it's much cleaner and a lot easier as well. So now I'm just going to go down and do the other three elements. Now before we attach the reflecting elements to the back here, I want to fit the support here, and this is the support for the main driven element. Now this is going to go exactly in the middle between the first parasitic element and the back reflecting element, and I've made this support out of cork, so I've cut a square out in the center so we can fit that up and over the top of the boom there. But I've cut out the square 31mm square, so it's 31mm that way and 31mm that way, and quite easy to do. I just used a simple set square to do that, and because it's cork, it's really easy to cut with a sharp knife. And then what I did, instead of painting it, I used some permanent marker and just used that to colour it in black, so it blends in a lot better with the finished Yagi here. So what I'm going to do now is tack this on in place using this line as a guide, so I want it to sit over the top of this line. I'm just going to tack it in with some super glue, and then I'm going to mix some epoxy up and drizzle some epoxy up around the sides here, just so it's in there nice and secured, it's not going to move anywhere. And the main driven element is going to sit on top of this, so it helps keep that secure as well. And it's a really nice way of fitting the driven element over the top of the Yagi, because of course it needs to be isolated from the boom as well. So I've got the Yagi fixed down so I can work on it with both hands. So I've just got it fixed on top of the roll of solder here at this end, and I've got some masking tape holding it down at this end, so that allows me to work on it with both hands. So I'm going to use the same method to attach the back reflector here, as I said, but this time I haven't got a tube to help me get it lined up properly, so I'm going to have to use the ruler. So that's why it's fixed down like this now, so I can have both hands free. So I'm going to just line it up at 29mm here on this side. Then I'm going to draw it this way, put some super glue in there, and then push it back and measure it more accurately then, and then hopefully that'll tack that in place, and then I can do the exact same method as I did with these. I can put some more super glue down on this side and a little bit more down on that side. Give it a little twist to get all that super glue all around the tube there. So now that I've got one side tacked in, I can just quickly check the measurements on both sides at 29mm there, and this side looks spot on, and so does this side. If one was a little bit too long, I could just get in there with a file and then file a little bit off when I've got it permanently super glued into place there. So again, same method as with the parasitic elements. I'm just going to drizzle a little bit of super glue inside there. Again, not too much. I'm just allowing gravity to work it in there. And for the two shorter pieces that make up the back reflector, I'm going to use the exact same method, and I've got this tube inserted in here, measure off at 29mm and then cut it off, and then insert it in with some super glue. But the final one that makes up this complete reflective element, I'm going to be drilling a hole through that, so I'll show you that one when I've got this one fitted. So I've got the final reflector positioned here in the hole, and I haven't super glued it in yet because I want to put a mark about 13mm up from the boom around this position here, and I'm going to drill a hole straight through this tubing at 3mm in diameter, and that will enable me to thread the coax cable through so I can connect to the driven element on the top here, and then we can connect the coax to a Wi-Fi card at the back. So that's the final element fitted in place, and you can see the hole that I've drilled through there. So if I thread my coax through, I can then attach it to the main driven element, and it comes through, lays nice and flat through the hole, and then we can connect to it at the back. It's just a neater job than bending the coax around the element here at the back. Now, I've been experimenting with the driven element for the Yagi antenna for quite a few months now, probably taking it seriously for the last two, but I've been looking at it on and off for quite a few months. And what I've found is, in particular with the driven element for the Yagi antenna, it is extremely sensitive, and the smallest amount of copper here can make a real difference on the center frequency of that Yagi antenna. If we take a look at this Yagi here, the parasitic elements and the reflector for that matter, you don't have to be too precise with the measurements for this. If say this first one is 0.5 millimeter shorter than the other three, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever in the center frequency operating of this Yagi antenna. But a very small amount of you know, a 1/4 millimeter even, I've been tuning these down with a small file, can make a vast difference. And I found that the thickness of the driven element as well makes a difference when you're bending to create your driven element itself, and it's something you have to take into consideration when you're making the driven element. That's why I said that this particular wire here is 1.5 millimeters long. So as long as you find something that's 1.5 millimeters, doesn't matter if it's steel or copper, you can use the exact same measurements that I'm using here. Now, one of the reasons it gets a little bit complicated is because of the thickness of the wire itself, as I've said. And the measurement, when we're taking the measurement of this at 1/4 wavelength, we're actually measuring from the center of the bends here. So when I'm lining it up on the ruler, I'm not lining it up to, I'm aiming for 31.25 millimeters. I'm lining it up at 31 millimeters, because when I put my bending on this side, I add a little bit due to the thickness of the wire itself. So the quarter wavelength is being measured from the center of each one of these curves. So for the first measurement then, it doesn't really matter what this measurement is, just as long as it's greater than 31.25 millimeters, so I can chop away at the end the excess that I don't want. So I'm going to measure in 35 millimeters and put a little black mark there, and that's where I'm going to put my first bend. So for my second measurement then, I'm measuring off at 31 millimeters, and I'm taking that measurement from this wire here. So the flat surface of this wire wants to line up with 31 millimeters on the ruler, and then I'm going to put a little black mark here, and that's where we're going to put our second bend. So now that I've put the second bend in, we can go back and we can measure it, and we want to measure it from the center of each one of these curves here. And if we measure it carefully, we'll see that the measurement is spot on for 31.25 millimeters, 31.5 millimeters around that kind of mark, because this is about as precise as you can get doing this by hand. So that's why if you measure it off at 31 millimeters, if you're using 1.5 millimeter gauge wire, you'll get it in that area, and you'll have a much more spot on center frequency element for 2.4 gigahertz than you would if you tried to measure it off at 31.25 millimeters, let's say. You'll end up with the driven element slightly too big, and it'll be off center frequency slightly. It'd still work, but it wouldn't be as precise as what this one is. So again, I've got this side of the element lined up at 31 millimeters, so I'll put a little black mark in here, and I'll put my next bend in. And finally the last bend to put into the element. So again, lined up at 31 millimeters. So to finish this element off, I need to cut both of these elements here in the middle. So I need to line that up on my ruler, and I'm going to line it up with the 30 millimeters roughly positioned into the center of the element like so, and then at 15 millimeters just put a little black line down the center there. So now what I need to do is get my side cutters and cut both of these wires through the center. So I've cut through the center, as you can see there, and what I'm going to do now is get some smaller side cutters and also a file to clean it up at the end, and just trim away about 1 millimeter on each side, just so we've got a gap much like this one here. So when we solder our center connector of our coax and our outer braid onto this side, for instance, they're not going to touch, and then we've got a nice loop antenna, all a quarter wavelength, until it comes to here when we've got an 1/8 of a wavelength and an 1/8 of a wavelength. This antenna, this driven element really does work well with this Yagi antenna, and I've been testing this for a while now. But if you do have a spectrum analyzer, there's one slightly different modification you can do with this if you've got a spectrum analyzer to tune it, and it's this type, where instead of cutting these elements off here and here, you can bend them out slightly, and what you can do then is solder this into position, and then hook it up to your spectrum analyzer, and you can cut these down a little bit at a time, each one of these, and you can really tune it to get a much better VSWR. Now I'm going to be doing that in this video, but unfortunately if you do copy the length that I managed to get these down to, it's different each time. Every time I make a Yagi antenna, whether it's the small errors in the elements or whatever, I don't know, but it's not the same each time, and that's one of the benefits of having a spectrum analyzer. I also think these are acting in a similar way to a balun, but it's definitely bringing the VSWR down just slightly lower than one of these. I mean, if you were to use both of these in the field, I really don't think you'll see much difference between them both, but it's just that this design here that I've come up with does get you a slightly better VSWR. But as I say, in the real world, you're not going to see a great deal of difference between the two. So I've prepared the coax to solder onto the driven element like so, and what I'm going to do is tin that up in a moment, and I'm going to use the coax. I'm going to solder the outer braid on first there, and then I'm going to solder on the inner core just there, and this little bit of dielectric here is going to force these two elements apart. So I've got them quite close together but not touching, being supported by the coax itself. And I've got it in this vise here because what I'm going to do is then tilt the vise when I've got this soldered on, and just run a little bit of epoxy down the sides of the driven element just to secure it to this cork support here and just keep its shape a lot better that way. So I'm going to try and solder this up on camera for you so you can see what I'm doing, but you know, you've got a better view than I have at the moment. But I've said in previous videos how useful it is to have a roll of masking tape in the lab, and I'm just using a piece of masking tape here to pull the other leg of the element here out of the way, so I can just get in with the soldering iron and solder the outer braid to this part here, and I haven't got them touching and I'm not trying to hold them apart with one of my fingers. So you know, masking tape is a really useful thing to have here in the lab. So I've already pre-tinned everything, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the iron to get some heat into the bottom of the element first, and then come on the top and try and squeeze it down a little bit. So I've bent the centre core down a little bit just to make contact with the other side of the element, then a little bit more solder on my iron, and we'll solder that in place. Get some heat into the brass itself first. And now the coax itself is keeping those two halves of the element separate, so I can remove this masking tape, but I'm going to keep it in this vise here. This vise is a really useful vise. It didn't cost a lot of money at all, just a few pounds from a local supermarket, but it's a really useful thing to have here in the lab because it's got this ball here, so I can tilt it in different directions. And what I'm going to do is just drizzle some epoxy down each side of the element just to hold it there onto the cork support, and also drizzle some on the underside as well. So next I'm going to add this little platform so we can support the Wi-Fi card. So I'm going to rivet this in place along the boom here. It's a rectangle piece of aluminium, about 2mm thick, and it's 100mm by 50mm. That should be big enough for most Wi-Fi cards. Now to connect this to a tripod, I've got hold of these. Now I normally give away the small tripod that I give away with the cantennas and the Biquad Yagis, and sometimes I get them that come with this holder here. Normally I first started throwing these away, but what I've found is I can remove the threaded bit from these. I can cut it out of here, grind one side down so it's flat, drill a hole that's 8mm into the boom here, and then insert this, and then we can screw a tripod directly into it. So that's how I'm going to do it. Otherwise you could put a little bracket on here, or you could drill a hole through here and try and tap it out. I've done that before as well, but this is a nice clean way to do this. I don't know if you can buy these on their own, but the tripods that I purchased are only 99p, and they come with these as well. And here in the UK they also sell these in the pound shop. So this is the little thread, and I've ground it down on this side so it's nice and smooth. So I'm just going to drill an 8mm hole in here and position it about there, and that'll give enough space to screw the tripod on there and not interfere with the back reflector here. So now I'm just finishing the Yagi off cosmetically. I've got the threads in there for the tripod. I've put some Velcro on the platform here for the Wi-Fi card. I can just stick a piece of Velcro to the Wi-Fi card and it'll hold it in place there. I've got these end caps that I got off eBay, and they're going to go on the ends to finish those off. And I've also got these end caps here, some 5mm ones and some 3mm ones that will go on the end of these as well. I got bags of 50 of these for just a few pounds from China, so They're not very expensive, and these I got from a seller in the UK. Again, I got about 20 of these for just a few pounds. So all these end pieces really finish off the Yagi quite nicely. So what I'm going to do now is hook it up to the spectrum analyzer and then tune this driven element. So here's the setup then. I'm using a directional coupler and the sweep signal generator feeding in to the spectrum analyzer. So let's have a look at the waveform on the spectrum analyzer. So here's the waveform then, and as it is, it's pretty good. We've got 2.4 gigahertz centered in the middle there. This is 2.5 gigahertz, so we're aiming in the middle of this square here. That's where we want to be, and we've got a very small frequency response there that goes down quite a bit, and then it comes up again, and then it's quite broad all the way to 2.5 gigahertz there. So from 2.4 to 2.5 it's got quite a broad frequency response, but we want to try and tailor this down a little bit so it comes down like a V in this direction here. This interference here is probably from a smart water meter or some kind of smart meter. I haven't figured that out yet, but you can see this small frequency response here. If I turn the sweep generator off, you'll see it more clearly. So that's a really nice response down there. So what we want to do is try and widen that a little bit to encompass a little bit more area. So this is the middle of the square here. We want to try and bring that out more into the middle. So I'm going to try and trim this live on camera. So what I'm going to start doing is removing about a millimeter off the end of each of these elements here, just to see if we can bring that frequency response in a little bit. So try and get in with my side cutters. Take about a millimeter off. Very difficult working around the camera. Right, let's see what we've got now. Let's refresh the screen. And you can see there we've opened up that dip a little bit. We've also got this second dip as well, and we're now starting to see a much more pronounced V in the area that we want. So I'm going to take another millimeter off each end and see what kind of response we get with that. See what's happened there on the screen. As you can see, it's widened up a little bit. We're now starting to get a really nice dip just there, and the trouble is with doing this, you kind of get carried away, and I have done many times. You end up taking too much off trying to chase the perfect frequency response. So I'm tempted to leave that as is. I mean, that is a really good frequency response, and if I purchased a Yagi antenna that gave me a response like that, I'd be pretty happy with that Yagi antenna. But let's see if we can trim a little bit more off and see if we can get it a little bit better. So we'll try and take another millimeter off. It's difficult working around the camera. Let's have a look at the screen again. Just refresh that. So I don't think we're going to get much better than that. It's a really nice pronounced V there, and it is working over quite a large range there, from 2.4 to 2.5 gigahertz, and right in the middle there, around 2.45 gigahertz, we've got the best response. So if I change the spectrum analyzer, move it over to 2.45, you'll see that frequency response is bang on 2.45. That's you can't really ask for much better than that. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at the frequency response of this one here with the more traditional driven element. Now this is the one you can make at home quite easily by following the measurements that I've just shown you. The other one, this is the more tuned one. Really difficult to do you know, at home, because every time I make one of these I tune each one individually and they're all slightly different, and it really depends on how well I've got the measurements on the parasitic elements and everything else to do with the Yagi antenna. So every time I do this, you know, it's a little bit different. But we'll have a look at the frequency response of this one, and you know, although this one's made more to measurements and cutting off, it's still probably going to be a nice little Yagi antenna. So this is the response from the more traditional driven element then, that square one, and you can see it's got a good frequency response right where we want it there, 2.45 gigahertz, and that's where its peak is at, but it hasn't got that nice pronounced V that the other one has got. So you know, this will perform, it will perform well, and this is probably typical of the you know, retail Yagi antennas that you can purchase. But the previous one, where you can tune it to be you know, a lot more pronounced exactly where you want it, the VSWR on the tunable one is going to be a lot lower, therefore the antenna is going to perform a lot better and perform better in that 2.4 to 2.45 gigahertz frequency range. But this one will still do the job, it's just not quite as tuned as the previous one. So I hope you found this video useful and of course interesting. It's been a lot of work putting this together, a lot of testing, a lot of making prototypes, and indeed this video, I started shooting this video some 2 months ago now, and I've only just got round to finishing it. And since you know, designing this and shooting the video, I've also decided to go along and paint them this really nice blue, rather than you know, I do paint everything black normally, but I think they come out rather well with this blue paint. It's a enamel paint, it's really hard, and it's designed to go on brake calipers on your car, so they do take a lot of heat, and it is designed to be really hard. It's a really nice paint, and it's not that expensive either, but it just puts a nice finish on the Yagi. And when I talked about the main driven element in this video, there's quite a lot more going on that than I included, because the video was getting on to be quite a length anyway. There's a lot more involved with the main driven element on this, and different factors that can change the outcome of the driven element. And indeed with a earlier version of this, before I started playing around with these little side bits here, these little wings on here, I did find that I was getting a good VSWR when it was much closer to the back reflector, and I played around with that a little bit as well. But this is the final one that I've you know, been happy with, where it's directly in the middle and it's got these two little wings out on either side. But I was getting a slightly better VSWR with the one without the wings, the normal loop driven element here, and also one that was a circle as well, having it much further back than this, probably, you know, 10 millimeters further back, closer to the main reflector on the Yagi. But there's lots and lots of different tweaks you can do to this to have a different outcome. It really is you know, quite in-depth designing a Yagi like this, but I'm happy with the outcome. I think it's a cracking little Yagi, and a small footprint as well, which is also quite a difficult thing to design with an antenna. It's much easier to make a powerful antenna but have it quite long or big than it is to make something in a small footprint and still have, you know, quite a high gain like this has got. And it's probably got around 14 dBi. I haven't tested it yet, but theoretically with all the measurements it should be around 14 dBi. So again, yeah, you'll probably look on eBay and say, you know, I've found one that's 21 dBi, but I guarantee you it isn't. It's quite difficult to build an antenna that has such a dBi of around 14 dBi. It's much easier to just lie and add a few more digits in there. So I will do an outside test on this, and for the benchmark I will use the Turbo 10 Yagi to test this against, just you know, outside on quite a bit of a distance range. But I was thinking about tagging it onto this video, but as I said, it was getting a little bit too long. I will put a couple of these in the shop as well to see how well they sell, but I haven't worked out a price yet. But the man hours in producing one of these is quite long. It's probably the most, as far as man hours are concerned, the most in-depth antenna I've designed so far. There's a lot more man hours in this than there is on you know, building most antennas. But I'll work out a price, put a few in, and see how well they sell. And if they seem popular, I'll make a few every now and again and put them in the shop, you know, when I've got a spare afternoon, make a couple up and see how we go from there. So if you did enjoy the video, as always, please give it a thumbs up. If you've got any ideas that you know, different roads I can go down to improve this, or maybe different areas to look at when it comes to the Yagi, because the Yagi antenna is so diverse. It's been around for a long time now, and there's so many different designs out there for the Yagi antenna. It's just, you know, it's unreal when you compare it next to most antennas. But if you've got any tips, then please let me know in the comments, and you know, any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. But I'm by no means a Yagi expert. I only become interested in this particular antenna a few years ago now. I didn't like it previous to that, and that was mainly because of the rubbish that you purchase off eBay that doesn't work. And you know, for that reason I wasn't particularly interested in the Yagi. But it is a very interesting antenna, just the way it works and everything else with it. So hopefully you did enjoy the video, and drop a comment below and let me know, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.